Yeah, no, and absolutely. Let's start with one that we're expecting as an outgoing one. That's Donyell Malen. I've written a piece on this negotiations with Aston Villa, and we all suspect in one way or another they're going to find a deal here, whether it's going to be 25 million or 30 million euros. My gut feeling here will be 25 plus the usual add-ons and a sell-on, and that all that kind of extra stuff that you throw in. By the time of recording, this is Tuesday. Dortmund essentially had rejected their first offer of 18 million euros, right? Again, I suspect this deal will go through, and it's such a weird one to me because Donyell Malen, and I've written this in the article, and when it comes out in Transfermarkt, you can dive into the statistics of this. Is a player of promise, I would say. He's a guy who really always had decent statistics, but when you really dive into the nick of things, it's always been, he hasn't scored in 10 games, and then all of a sudden he goes on a run and scores 7 goals in 9 games, and then the stats all of a sudden look really good at the end of the season, right now they don't, because he hasn't really been on a run like that. But it's always been like when they signed him for 30 million euros, I think they expected a lot more consistency from him. They never really got it. They never really got the player that he was in the Netherlands. And I have the sense that even if they're now selling him for a loss, because they paid 30 million euros upfront for him, right? And if, let's say, they do sell him for 25 plus promises, I think they would do it simply to make that space in the Dortmund roster, because I very much sense this is about getting someone in, at least, in this window, who can provide goals on a regular basis, score frequently, help Serhou Guirassy with goal scoring. And I feel that that's what Dortmund is doing here. They said they sense an opportunity with Aston Villa coming in, needing a player up front as well. They're quite thin when you look at their roster, right? They're pushing for a Champions League spot. The race in the Premier League for the Champions League. I mean, the race for the Premier League, in the Premier League for a Champions League spot is just like it is in the Bundesliga. It's really tight. There's a lot of teams that are kind of in and around that fourth spot, right? And so any edge you can get, I guess Aston Villa is hoping to get it. But my sense of writing this article, and I'm curious how you feel about it, but for me, this is Dortmund trying to move on from an asset that really never really quite worked out for them, and trying to use that money and the funds that become available to bring in a different player.
Yeah, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. I think, first and foremost, I think maybe Dortmund have gone through the squad and said, right, who are the players we could probably sell if we have to this summer? And I think Donyell Malen's probably top of that list. There's quite a lot of reports over the last couple of years. He's been kind of pushing for a move. I've always suspected that he only really made the move to Dortmund in the first place with the impression of using it as a stepping stone to England or Spain anyway. So, in a sense, this is exactly the kind of move he was hoping to get. And as you said, if they can pick up 20, 25 million euros for him, it's not what they would have hoped for when they paid, what did you say, 30 million euros for him in the first place. Yeah. I guess the kind of somewhat unfortunate kind of situation with the Bundesliga these days is that if a club like Dortmund or Leipzig or Leverkusen spend 30 million euros on a player, they expect to sell them for 60 or 70 million euros in 2 or 3 years' time. That's the only real reason that they would spend a lot of money on players like this. But yeah, if you go through that kind of list of wingers that Dortmund have, or forwards if you want, or attacking midfielders, it's kind of easy to see why Donyell Malen kind of sticks out there. I think, for example, Julian Brandt, he's not going anywhere. Gio Reyna still technically a prospect, I think, at Dortmund. Although, of course, he was out on loan last season and could easily be sold as well, I suppose. Jamie Gittins is going nowhere. Karim Adeyemi, again, a player that probably could have left last year, but has kind of rebounded under Nuri Sahin, so he's not really going to go anywhere. Julian Duranville really kind of came into his own this season, and once he returns from injury, will be pushing for a starting role. You've got young Cole Campbell, another very young player, very talented young player, 18 years old. He's not going to go anywhere. Guirassy and then Maximilian Bayer, 2 players, of course, who've just joined the club, aren't going anywhere. So if you go through that entire front line, and Dortmund are looking for players that they can maybe move on, Donyell Malen's really the only one. So there's that aspect of it. But I think there's also, as you said, the other aspect of it as to whether he's actually kind of lived up to the potential. And I just don't really think he has. Interestingly enough, I kind of posted on Blue Sky about this, link talking about the Aston Villa rumours. And I basically said, it hasn't really worked out for him at Dortmund, and Matt Ford, obviously, of this publication, kind of pushed back on it. We had a back and forth talking about it all, and he made some very fair points. But I think at the end of the day, his goal scoring, his assist making, he definitely had purple patches where he looked like the man. He looked like the guy who was going to be Dortmund's talisman. And at times he obviously did that. Last season he was quite good as well. But as you said, he was also just far too capable of just dropping off for an entire month or two at any given time. And as a result, I think over the course of the kind of 2 or 3 years he's been at Dortmund, he's just proven to be far too inconsistent and far too undependable. Unreliable is maybe the word I'm looking for there. Now, like I said on Blue Sky, that might not be his fault. Dortmund are a complete mess. You can go through that entire front line and say there's not a single player there who's really been a consistent star and has been played properly by every coach who's been at Dortmund over the last 3, 4, 5 years. So I wouldn't be surprised at all if Donyell Malen moves to Aston Villa, slots in as like a sort of second striker behind Ollie Watkins and actually does really well there. Because plenty of Bundesliga players have gone to the Premier League and actually done better in the Premier League than they did in the Bundesliga. It just really comes down to the head coach that they have, circumstances they're playing in, or even just the team that they're playing in. And I suspect that Donyell Malen just has a little too much competition at Dortmund. He's never really been able to nail down, not so much a starting role, but not so much a starting position, but actually nail down what his role is in this team. He's never been able to say, I am the right winger, or I am the left winger, or I am the number 10, or I am the number 9, or the second striker. I'm sure if you had 10 Dortmund fans in a room and asked them what Donyell Malen's best position is, they'd probably give you 5 different answers. So, yeah, for one thing or another, I do stand by my point. I just think he hasn't done enough. I don't think he has lived up to the hype, really, at Dortmund. And I guess they're probably thinking, hey, look, if we can actually sell this guy for 25 million euros, then it's probably worth it, and they can obviously put that money elsewhere in the squad. Yeah, no,
I think it really, when I went through the stats, the one thing that I've noticed is it's okay. Every forward is streaky, right? Very, very few. Like, it's only the very top strikers that have this ability to pretty much almost score every game. And he isn't obviously in that category. So every forward in that category below is streaky. They all have 2 or 3 games where they maybe don't score, but there's been patches where he didn't score for 9 to 10 games, and that is just not acceptable with the price tag that he came with. And I think at this rate, Dortmund can't afford having that. They are outside of a Champions League spot, right? Let's remember, that it was that final win before the winter break that even got them back into the Champions League conversation. They were 1 defeat away from dropping all the way down. What was it, 11th in the Bundesliga? It is razor thin right now, whether you are in the Champions League conversation or in the middle of nowhere. And so they just need consistency. They need players that can consistently score for them, and maybe also what they require a little bit is a little bit more leadership up front as well, and a little bit more character. And that's, I think, another thing that he just seemed like one of the other guys, right? Like just a bystander, more or less, not someone who would roll up his sleeves and get the job done. And I think that is sort of where Dortmund are at the moment, and in a precarious situation. They cannot afford, and we talked about this on this podcast before, they cannot afford to miss out on Champions League football. And they cannot rely on going on another run like they did last year where they reached the Champions League final. I wouldn't put that beyond them because, there seems to be 2 different clubs. There seems to be Champions League Dortmund and Bundesliga Dortmund, but, you can't rely on that. And so, I think this is all about maybe also just mixing up the room a little bit, moving on from one player and maybe bringing in another one. And